Hello. You hear that? Yes, I can hear that coming through the speakers. It's great to see you all here. I am in the design track, which is a little bit strange for me because I'm definitely not a designer, as you'll be able to tell from my examples. But it's really great to see you all here and to be able to talk a bit about CSS Grid Layout, a module of which I am an incredible fan. Because I've been doing CSS, I've been working on the web anyway since sort of 96, 97. I've been doing CSS since CSS became a thing. I remember arguing with people about whether or not we should be using font tags or not. I was doing CSS Layout when we had Netscape 4 and battling with those browsers. So I've been doing CSS for a very long time. And while a lot of the stuff in CSS has really moved on and we can do some really cool things with CSS, the area of CSS which really seems to have kind of stopped in terms of day-to-day work is layout. We're still battling for our sort of major page layouts and things. We're still battling with floats and positioning and doing hacky things with inline block, and it all feels a bit kludgy. And it's for that reason that when I first got sight of CSS Grid Layout, I got really excited, because it really does seem to solve a lot of the problems that we've been battling with for a very long time, that I've been battling with for a long time. Now, it's a massive spec. Grid Layout is a very, very complex spec. It introduces quite a lot of fairly new concepts. I certainly can't claim to understand it all. I've been playing around with it for quite a while, since the early implementation. And so what I'm going to show you today are some of the kind of key features of Grid Layout. Some of the things that actually work now in Chrome behind a flag, so you can actually play with them. And I've got links. At the end of this, I'll give you a link where you can find these slides and my example code, which is on CodePen, so you can actually go and use a supporting browser and have a play around with it. Because I think that really it doesn't really kind of make sense until you get your hands on it and start playing. So very quickly, just a history of the spec and where the specs come from. The first public draft was April 2011, so it's a relatively new specification. Now, it was actually a proposal developed by Microsoft. Now, if you've been working on the web for a long time, like me, then Microsoft are kind of the company that we all hate, because they brought us things like Internet Explorer 6, which then hung around for ages and has been driving us all mad. But the Microsoft team are doing some fantastic work. I've been writing about several of these newer layout modules, and for a long time, it was IE10 was the browser I was using to demonstrate them, because the Microsoft team had implemented a lot of this early stage stuff. They're doing some great work, and this module is something that came out of that. So there's an early implementation in Internet Explorer 10. Now, the spec has moved on from the IE10 implementation, not because Microsoft got it wrong, it was their spec, but because that implementation has allowed us to gather experience and to see where things could be improved, really, in terms of how we might use it. So the spec that is in IE10 is quite different from the things that I'm going to be showing you today. This is the latest working draft from May of this year. And it's that draft that I've sort of got my examples based on. Now, these examples work in Chrome behind the Experimental Web Platform Features flag. So all of these things that I'm showing you today, you can actually get your hands on and have a look at. So, some examples. I'm going to start with what we call line-based placement. So I've got some markup here. I've got an article with just some elements inside it. So if I don't apply a layout, we get something like this. The central area is the article element. It's got a class of wrapper applied, and that's the thing I'm going to set up as a grid and start positioning things onto. So grid gives us new values for the display property. We get display grid, and we get display inline grid. And those do really what you would imagine. Grid is block level grids, and you can do inline level grids too. So once you've declared a grid on an element, that means that child elements can be positioned on that grid. But before we can position things, we need to say something about the grid. We need to describe what it's like, how many columns and rows and so on it's got. Now, we do that with grid template columns and grid template rows properties. Now, what I'm making here is a bit like an old school liquid flexible layout. So we've got a 200 pixel column, we've got a 40 pixel gutter, we've got a section in the middle that stretches with the width of the browser, a 40 pixel gutter, and a 200 pixel column. It's worth knowing you have to specify your gaps. There's no kind of column gap property or anything like that, like you might have seen in other specs. You have to specify the gaps as well as the sort of content columns as well. And for grid template rows, I've just set that value to auto. So that's something that auto is something that's worth taking note of. If you just want to create as many rows as you want in your grid, depending on how much content there is, and have those stretch to whatever height is needed to take that content, you can just use auto. There's this idea of explicit grid lines, which are the ones you've specified, and implicit ones, which just appear because you've put something into that section. So you can just say, if you're not too worried about the height of those rows, you can just say auto and it'll just work it out. So things start now looking a little bit odd inside our container. That's because we've declared a grid and we've set up columns and rows, but we've not said where we want that stuff to go. So the browser is making some decisions about that, which is based on an algorithm, the grid auto placement algorithm, which decides what the browser should do with elements that you haven't set up on the grid. And there's also a property grid auto flow, which dictates how items should happen, sort of to be placed in that situation, which we'll not get into, because generally, if you're using grid, you probably want to position the items on the grid. You're not going to be letting the browser make those decisions for you. So we're going to start actually positioning those elements now. So we use grid column start and grid column end properties, which declare the grid lines before and after the content. And then we use grid row start and grid row end to declare the grid lines above and below the content. So doing this with content, that now hops down into row 2, taking advantage of the fact I didn't need to say there was a row 2 because it will just add one. And we can do the same thing with everything else. Putting the main nav into the first column, second row, and the subheading above the content in the first row, and the quote then goes into that final third column. So we essentially end up with something like this. Now, it's going to make it a bit easier if we actually have a look at how the grid works and see the grid overlaid over this. So that's the grid. I've taken out some of the content. You can see the bottom of it. So you can see how the grid forms columns and gutters. Now, if we take that content as an example, so here's what we specified for the content. So grid column start is line 3. Grid column end, that's line 4. Grid row start is line 2. And grid row end is line 3. So what we're doing with these lines is we're basically drawing a box around the content. We're not targeting the content in the middle, we're targeting the lines around it. And this is quite clever, because it means that if we want to span over several columns, we just specify the ending line. We don't need to do sort of spans and things. And this is a difference between this new implementation of the spec and the earlier Microsoft one. In the Microsoft implementation, you have this sort of sense of spanning. And it made it quite difficult to do a lot of things because you had to sort of work out how much to span. With this spec, you just specify where you want it to end. So if, for example, we wanted to add a footer to the design, and a footer that will always sit under the content no matter which column is longer, we might do something like this. So the footer needs to go into row 3, and it needs to stretch right across the bottom of the page. So if I add the footer to the markup, and I pop that inside the article element because that's got the grid declared on it, it needs to be a child. We want it to stretch across the whole grid, so we started at column 1, and we ended at column line 6. And it's, the content ends at row 3, so we start this content at line 3 and end at line 4. And that now starts the content. And there's no messing about with clearing. That footer is in its own row of the grid. It doesn't matter how long any of those content columns are, because those are in row 2, so they're above it. And I think this kind of shows the simplicity of grids. We don't have to mess around doing anything special to make things stay in their row. They're just going to stay in their row because that's where we've put them. Line-based positioning is fairly verbose, having to specify the start and end of everything. So as you'd probably expect with CSS, there are some shorthand ways of declaring those. And in fact, there's a couple of ways of doing this with shorthand. So I'll show you those. So you can use grid column and grid row properties, which allow you to declare both start and end with one property and value. So the first value of grid column is start, that's grid column start, and then you have a /, and then you have grid column end. That's exactly the same with rows. So that means you can kind of collapse 4 rules down into 2 there. And we can get even shorter. We can declare all 4. So again, / is separating them. The order of these is grid row start, grid column start, grid row end, and grid column end. And good luck with remembering that. Because yeah, I'm not sure. I think the one before, I think is probably what I would use. I think sometimes making things too short is just more confusing. So what we have really is, that's the longhand there, which is exactly the same as that, which is exactly the same as that. But the thing with that, it's pretty cool because that's your entire layout specified with 4 lines of CSS. Now, I think that is very, very cool when you've been dealing with sort of clearing floats and things for all these years. So what I've just been talking about was, something that was like an old school liquid layout. Now, at this point, most of us are building responsive designs. Now, grid is a brilliant tool for responsive design because you can redefine the grid, or you can redefine where things sit on the grid. So let's have a look at that with the same layout. So the source order of the elements is we've got the main nav, a subhead, we've got content, and we've got a quote. So if we just leave them alone, we'll end up with them just laid out like that. As I say, I'm not a designer. I'm sure other people would do something pretty. But we've got them just stacked up in order. So at 460 pixels, I declare the grid just as a single column. I want to start moving things around, so I'm declaring a grid. Now, for whatever reason, I've decided that on wider screens, slightly wider screens, I'm going to stick that quote between the subheading and the content. So I just pop it into the second row, using the shorthand syntax here. And so the quote then moves up between the subhead and the content. Now, this is the thing that got me really excited about grids. It properly gets us away from source order dictating our layouts. And if you've done a lot of responsive design, I'm sure you've come against the issue where you kind of want something in one order on mobile, you want it on a different order for, on a tablet, you want to move it around for the desktop, and you're having to make decisions about your source order to be able to get the layout that you want. And the thing that we've always wanted, ever since we started doing CSS for layout, the thing that we said over and over and over was that we should be separating our presentation from the source order. And we've kind of got there, but not quite. Grid lets us get there, and just very easily. We can say, well, I want this up here visually. We can make decisions about our source and about how we want to have that content in the document, and then we can display it in whatever way we like. Which is very, very cool. There's no risk of anything overlapping because they're all in their own little boxes on the grid. So I'm redefining the grid again at the 700 pixel breakpoint. And this time I'm going to a 2-column layout. There's 3 columns there, which is a sidebar, and then a gutter column, the 5%, and then an auto stretching column on the right. So in this 2-column version, I put the nav between the lines 1 and 2, and the subhead, quote, and content between 2 and 3. So again, this is all inside my media queries for that breakpoint. And so we end up with something like this. And then when we get back to 980 pixels, I'm going back to that 3-column layout that we were looking at before. We pull out the quote and we put it into the right sidebar area between columns 5 and 6. And so we end up with something like this again. As I say, you could have as many things as you want and move them around. It doesn't matter. As long as they're a child of the element that you have set as a grid, you can move them around however you want. So whether you can nest grids, you can have a grid inside a grid. If you just declare that as a grid, it will behave as an independent grid. So you can have its own columns and rows. There is a subgrid syntax in which things should basically take on the grid definition from the outer grid. That I don't believe works at all in Chrome at the moment. But I think that would be quite cool with more complex layouts. But you could put nesting grids as independent grids works fine. So that was a fairly simple example. But kind of remembering where the lines are and having to sort of work out where to place things based on lines can be fairly tricky. Especially if you've got other people working with your design, you've set it up and you want other people to know where to place things. Grid also gives a way of specifying areas of the grid with a name, and then you can place elements into that area. So we'll have a look at that, because I think that's a really nice way of working with grid. So outside of my media queries, the first thing I need to do is give things a name. So I'm using this grid area property again, which we used for the very shorthand method of line-based positioning. And here I'm assigning elements of my markup, the same markup as before, to a grid area. So those names, so grid area, nav, subhead, they're just the names I've decided to call things, so I can identify them later. So then in the media queries, I can define where I want those areas to go on the grid. So this is a narrow screen with a min width of 460 pixels. So basically, I'm setting them up one after the other on the grid, just as we did before, pulling out that quote and putting it above the content. And you can see between the quote marks there, you've got the names that I set up earlier to say which order they want to go in. So that's pretty much as before, just all stacked up. So then we go to 2 columns. Now again, we've got those 3 columns to deal with. We've got a gutter column. We've not named that, but that doesn't matter. We just use a period, a full stop, to indicate a column that we're not naming. So if you look in my grid template areas, I've got ... subhead. Those dots are just saying there's a column here, leave it empty, and then put the subhead on the far right. The other thing you can see here is I've repeated the nav there because I want that to just spread down that column. So this looks like this. So I've moved that feature image, the big image, I moved that up, so it's actually above the content. And then we go to 3 columns. And you can kind of see the layout quite nicely at 3 columns. You can see that ... the subhead there is in the middle. You've got 2 dots for the far right, gutter and column. Then we've got nav, a gutter, the feature image, and then we've got a quote, and then nav and content and a quote. So you can kind of see how the layout there is kind of described in that grid template areas property, which gives us something like this. So we don't name any lines here, we name areas, which I think is a little easier to sort of get your head around, or certainly it's sort of easier to set that up and then be able to move things around without worrying too much about the setup of it. I think once you get used to this syntax, it's a really nice way of being able to move things around your design. And when you think, oh, this stuff, it isn't really useful yet, it only works in Chrome behind a flag, you know, when am I going to use this? I use this for prototyping. Because if I'm looking at a sort of responsive design, I'm thinking, you know, where should these items go to? How should they flow? How should they fit in? I can play around with it. as a prototype. Yes, I know I'm going to have to then take a step back and rewrite it using something more old-fashioned, and that's going to be quite annoying. But I can play around with this while I just sort of work out where I want things to be, because it's so easy to move stuff around your grid. It's so straightforward. So when I was originally playing with the Internet Explorer 10 implementation of Grid, one of the things I wanted to do was to have a look at these sort of 16-column flexible grid things that you see a lot, which, at the moment tend to be with floats and so on. Because I thought, well, that's something that people are doing with grids. And I think if people think about grids, they think about these sort of 16-column grid sort of setups. So I wanted to have a go at that. And I did that. I wrote an article in 2012 for 24 Ways, and so I set up one of these grid things and sort of really hit up against the edges of the IE10 implementation doing that, and needed to use a preprocessor to work out where things go and things. So having done that, when this new spec came out and we got the Chrome implementation, the first thing I wanted to do was to see if I could replicate that and see if it was easier. And it turns out that it's an awful lot easier, and I think this works really well. But before I sort of show that grid, I'm going to introduce 3 new concepts. I mentioned at the start that grid brings us all sorts of new things that we're not really using yet, and so I want to sort of explain some of those first, otherwise the example looks really baffling. So we can name grid lines. So before we were sort of positioning things in our grid with line-based positioning, we were doing that by saying start at 1 and end at 3 or what have you. You can also name the lines, which is what we're doing here. So what you do is you name the line and not the content column. So in this example, you've got nav start, which is the line before a column which is going to have the navigation in, and nav end, and then a gutter column, and then you've got content start and the content area, and then content end. Then you've got side start and the sidebar area and side end. Now, that all, you've got to kind of work that out. But once you've done that, you can then say, I want my content to go grid column content start / content end, which is easier than remembering where the lines are. So that's a useful point to note. You can name your lines. And you can also use a repeat keyword, which if you're doing like this 16-column type grid system, you don't want to have to write out the whole thing. You can use a repeat keyword. So here we've got repeat 4 times, this 200 pixel, 20 pixel setup. So that will just save writing out 200 pixel, 20 pixel 4 times. You can use repeat to do that. And then we also have this flexible length unit, which represents a fraction of the available space in the grid container. So you can quite easily say, I'd like this column to be twice as wide as another, or specify the proportion of gutter columns to content columns. You can mix absolute widths, so pixel widths or whatever, and these flexible widths. Now, if you're old like me, I think some of this is going to be looking really familiar because it feels very like table-based layouts. And that's how I get my head around it. I'm really visualizing this as a table-based layout because that really is what it is. That's what we were doing with tables. We were creating grids with them and sticking things into areas. And really, that's what we've got with grid layout conceptually, except we've got the advantage of being able to redefine it and change it depending on our media queries or whatever. But in terms of what you're thinking about as you're creating these things, you're essentially creating, a big table to stick your content into. So, having looked at those things, this definition looks a bit more complex. We start to get these kind of baffling incantations, which were the first things I encountered when I started reading the spec, is stuff like this. And you think, what on earth? It does look, quite complicated. So what we're doing here is we're naming the lines. Gutter is the line before the gutter column. Col is a line before the content column. We start with a gutter, then we repeat 16 times col and gutter. You can also see I'm using flexible length units, so the columns I'm using as gutters remain in proportion to the actual columns. So the layout can flex. It's a flexible grid, rather than a fixed pixel width one. So to replicate a common demonstration of these grid systems, you can create a bunch of divs in the markup, giving them each a name. And then you can start to position them on the grid using more baffling syntax like this. I'm going to explain this in a minute. But so what we end up with, if we set up a whole bunch of boxes, we end up with this sort of thing, which is the sort of standard demo you see of these grid systems. And if you look at my examples at the link later, you can see this flexes with the browser window. And the columns remain in proportion to the gutters and so on, which is sort of what you'd expect. So if we have a look at a simple but a slightly more realistic example, I've got this markup here. So I've got, again, a wrapper, and I've got elements inside it. I've got a header, a side article, and so on. And I can position it on the grid using this terrifying-looking incantation, which is less crazy than it looks, I promise. So let's take the header. So we've got the same shorthand syntax as earlier. The / is separating start and end. We're using named lines and the span keyword, which is another new thing. So grid column start for the header line is just the ident col, which means we'll start at the very first line named col. Grid column end is span gutter 16, because I want to span 16 lines named gutter, which will essentially give me a full width header in row 1. So that's the completed layout. And if we highlight the full width header there on the grid. So then if we take the content, we can start on the 5th line named col and span 8 lines named gutter. So if we go back to the layout, and that ends up sitting there. Now, I think that is potentially quite confusing to wrap your head around, but I think once we get the idea of that, it's actually quite an elegant way of defining things. I've sort of been playing around with it, and you can, obviously redefine the grid if you want, or you can keep your 16-column grid and just redefine where things sit on it based with your media queries. And it's very straightforward. And all of this stuff, as I say, works very nicely in Chrome, so you can play with it. It is fairly baffling at first. I've kind of worked through this fairly slowly, in my own work and sort of picked out bits of it. But even yesterday, I was sort of going through, I was testing all my examples, because every time I do this talk, I fire up Chrome and discover that something looks different and have to retake all my screenshots. So I was playing around with it, and I looked in the spec and spotted something else that I hadn't really wrapped my head around before. There's a huge amount of interesting stuff to unpick in the spec. But really, at a base level, it's quite straightforward. And I think if you start playing with the examples, you'll see that. You need to enable experimental web platform features in Chrome and, do have a play with it. There's not that many people talking about grid layout at the moment. And I want to make sure it gets into all our browsers, so we have actually got our hands on it. And I think one of the ways that we, as web developers, can do that is to talk about it and to write about it and to point out problems we see with it or report back to the mailing list about it. Because if we're not pushing for this stuff, then we're going to end up with kind of hacky floats and so on forever. And having seen this brave new world, I don't really want to have to stay there. So I've left some time for questions because I usually get some, and hopefully, if you want to come and grab me later, I'll probably be hanging around the lounge. I like talking about grid. Find my stuff there, and I'm also on Twitter. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Do we have questions? Please raise your hand.
Probably terrified them all now. It's too early in the morning.
Hi. How do you handle backward compatibility if you deploy these new techniques? You
don't at the moment. This is behind a flag in Chrome. It's certainly not something that you can put into production at the moment. I mean, ultimately, you probably could. I mean, it's very difficult, but I think one of the reasons that we haven't moved on so much with layout is it's really, really difficult to implement new stuff when it's like your entire layout. That's really hard because, you know, it's not just saying, oh, well, if I use a little bit of Flexbox and it is not supported and it falls back and it's linear, well, that's okay. That doesn't really work when we're talking about these sort of big layouts. I mean, you could obviously start detecting it once it's in some browsers. You could start detecting it with, you know, something like Modernizer or what have you, and then forking your layout for the two. I think that's the big sticking point with stuff like this, is it's really, really hard to make the leap. But we've made the leap before. We made the leap to CSS positioning. You know, I remember it. So, you know, I think we can. But yeah, I think backwards compatibility, as this comes into browsers, is going to start to be really difficult. And it'll be interesting to see what solutions come up, you know, people come up with for that.
Okay, thank you.
Is there some like central place where you, like a working group or something that's following that spec?
Yes.
And also another related question, is it maybe in some kind of competition with other display properties like Flex that have more impact at the moment maybe?
Well, so to feedback, it's the www style mailing list. I think CSS Grid is the mark to put at the beginning. Yes, it's been discussed there, and you know they tend to be very open to people coming and saying, oh, you know, I've tried this and this is what happened, or I'm not sure if this is right or whatever. They've been very helpful to me as I've sort of fumbled my way through it. Yeah, and in terms of competition, I mean, really, Flexbox and Grid are two very different things. I mean, Grid is really for your sort of big layouts, your sort of, you know, your bigger things. Flexbox is really better for those sort of smaller UI elements. And performance isn't really my speciality, but I've sort of seen people writing that Jake Archibald had a good post, which is in my notes for this, about the performance issues of using Flexbox for full layouts. And I think Grid seeks to solve those sort of things, you know, by actually being a layout method which is designed for big full-page layouts and so on. So I think it fits quite nicely into the things we've got, and really is a replacement of, you know, what we're doing at the moment with sort of floats and things.
Further questions?
How fast or slow can you guess? Can you make a guess? Will major browser vendors implement these things? Is there anything you can guess or say about this?
Yeah, so the status at the moment is that Chrome has quite a good implementation. All the stuff I've talked about today works in Chrome. There are things missing. It's behind a flag. I don't know at what point that will make it out from behind a flag, but at the moment they seem to be putting an awful lot of work into it. i10 and 11 still have the old version of this implemented. I don't know whether they're going to then move to the current implementation. How quickly this moves on, I think partly it comes down to whether there's pressure to actually have it. You know, if we want it in our hands, we need to start saying something about it and writing about it and things. But there does seem to be forward movement on it, and certainly it's a very active topic. It's, you know, it's discussed a lot. You know, if you can follow the mailing list and things. So, you know, I'm hopeful that there is momentum. It's come a long way, given that it is a relatively new spec.
Yeah, thanks for the talk. I saw this template string is pretty complex, right? So you have this dot syntax and whatnot. So I think this is maybe a pretty good target for a preprocessor library.
Yeah.
Where you can construct these kind of grids.
Yes.
Do you know, are there already existing
I haven't seen any. That I'm not really a preprocessor person, so that isn't necessarily meaning that there isn't any. But yeah, certainly, I mean, it would be. The earlier spec, I was using less to sort of mess around with it because it was even more complex to actually get these sort of grid systems to work. I think, yeah, it's going to be an ideal thing for preprocessors to make something a little more easy to sort of understand and work with. I'm sure we'll see that. It'd be interesting to see how people kind of reinvent how to use it, which is what happens with the preprocessors. So it'd be interesting to see how that happens.
If you create mixins, I would definitely use it.
Yeah.
So.
Any further questions?
There's one here in the middle.
How easy is it to visualize the grid in the browser? Do you just slap a 1-pixel border on it, or do you use the web inspector? And do you even see the names then?
Yeah, I've been using the web inspector, but yeah, I mean, I think it would be really nice to see some tools that worked with this to allow us to better visualize. And I think for designers working with this particularly, just being able to visualize them. I think probably because I cut my teeth figuring out nested table layouts, I'm quite used to having to visualize a sort of horrendous structure of stuff. But maybe people who've just come from, have always worked with CSS don't have that in their head. But that's very much how I see it. I see it very much as this sort of a table layout structure. But I think, yeah, I mean, when we were doing nested table layouts, the thing that saved us all back then was Dreamweaver. And like the fact that it had a really good, you could like have all your manky nested tables and you could see it nicely in Dreamweaver. And this I think maps really nicely to visual design tools. And some of the things that maybe Adobe are doing and what have you. Because you are getting away from worrying about the source order, it makes it a lot easier for a visual design tool to say, well, I want this here, and this here, without having to worry about, well, what's happening to the source there? Are we sticking a load of random stuff into the source? So I'd be very interested, way back when I used to work with what was Macromedia on Dreamweaver, and I'd be very interested to see if some of these modern web tools start to use grid as it comes in, because I think it actually is perfect for that visual medium.
We have another question here.
Have you any experience with major frameworks? For example, I know that Foundation is taking the Flexbox much forward for using or for doing the framework for mobile applications. So, do you have any experience in this matter?
Not really, and certainly not with this. I think it's a bit early. But yeah, again, I think any of these tools will find that grid makes life an awful lot easier for them. Again, just because of this separation of source and content. So I think, yeah, it'd be nice to see it making into the frameworks. It's just too early at the moment because it doesn't work for realistic things, unfortunately.
All right. Any further questions? Otherwise, I would say go to Rachel offline and ask any further questions that you might come up with later on.
Yeah, I've got all my examples on my laptop, so if you come and grab me in the lounge, we can always have a look at things if you've got any specific things you want to ask. Okay, perfect. So there are some high tables that you can sit around and show to everybody these examples. All right, meet you here at 11 o'clock.